New York, the 1940s. Somewhere past midnight, a body lies on the wet pavement, and a crowd is already gathering. Then a man pushes through them, raises a camera the size of a lunchbox, and fires. For one blinding instant, a flashbulb the size of a fist turns the dark street into daylight and freezes the whole scene forever. One sheet of film, one shot. If he missed it, there was no second chance, and no front page in the morning. This was a camera that did the exact opposite of hiding. It was huge, it was loud, and it shoved its way into every crime scene and every headline of its age. So how did the most visible camera ever made, the machine that practically was the news, end up vanishing almost without a sound? Last time, we met a camera built never to be seen, small, silent, and made to disappear. This is the story of its exact opposite. A camera you could not hide if you tried, enormous instead of tiny, deafening instead of silent, built to be pointed straight at the world, in full view, with a burst of light that everyone for a block could see. Where one camera vanished by being invisible, this one ruled by being impossible to ignore. This is the story of the Speed Graphic. Chapter 1. The Beast. Pick up a Speed Graphic, and the first thing you feel is the weight. This was not a thing you slipped into a pocket. It was a slab of wood, leather, and metal the size of a small briefcase, with a bellows that pulled out the front like an accordion, and a lens you focused by hand while watching the image form on a panel of frosted glass at the back. Inside went a single sheet of film, 4 inches by 5, a negative larger than the entire body of the camera from our last story. One exposure, then you pulled the holder out, flipped it over, or loaded another, and did it all again. Bolted to the side was a chrome reflector almost as wide as a dinner plate, and into it you screwed a flashbulb the size of a fist, a bulb that burned out in a single, blinding flash and could never be used twice. It was slow, it was heavy, it was loud, and in the right hands it produced an image of breathtaking, enormous clarity. A negative so large you could read a face in the back of a crowd. In an age before the small camera took over, this beast was not a compromise. It was the professional standard. It was what the word photographer looked like. To understand the Speed Graphic, you have to understand what it demanded of the person holding it. With a tiny modern camera, you can fire off a dozen frames in a second and pick the best one later. With a Speed Graphic, you had a handful of film holders in your coat and maybe one chance at the picture that mattered. There was no motor, no burst, no easy second try. You had to read the moment before it happened. You had to set your focus, judge your exposure, and have the camera already raised when the instant arrived, because the instant would not wait for you. So press photographers became a particular kind of person, calm, fast, and a little fearless. They learned to walk into chaos, plant their feet, and trip the shutter at exactly the right fraction of a second. The camera did not make it easy. That was the point. It turned taking a single photograph into an act of nerve. Out of that pressure came a famous piece of advice, passed around newsrooms for generations. F8 and be there. It sounds almost too simple. Set your lens to a middle aperture, f8, so a good slice of the scene falls into focus. And then do the only thing that truly matters, be there. Be in the right place, at the right moment, with the camera ready. The line is often attributed to Weegee and the press photographers of this era, though no one can really say for certain who coined it first, but it captured the whole philosophy of the Speed Graphic perfectly. It was never about firing 100 frames and hoping. It was about understanding the world well enough to be standing in exactly the right spot when it happened, and getting it in one. In a strange way, the sheer difficulty of the camera made its pictures matter more. Every frame had cost something. Every frame was a decision. No one embodied the Speed Graphic more completely than a man who called himself Weegee. His real name was Arthur Fellig, a press photographer working the streets of New York in the 1930s and 40s. He photographed the city at its rawest. Fires, arrests, wrecks, and crime scenes. Almost always at night, almost always with a Speed Graphic and a blazing flashbulb. What made him a legend was that he always seemed to get there first. He kept a police radio in his car, reportedly reaching some scenes before the police themselves. He even developed film in the back of his own automobile, so he could sell a picture while it was still wet. His photographs were harsh, direct, and lit by that single brutal burst of light. The bystanders' faces, the shock, the aftermath, all frozen in stark black and white. He even named his own 1941 exhibition, with grim honesty, "Murder is my business." Weegee understood something about this camera that went beyond technique. The flash was not just light, it was a kind of violence of its own, a sudden theatrical burst that tore the scene out of the darkness and made it impossible to look away from. His New York was a city of hard shadows and startled faces, precisely because that single bulb left no room for softness. And the pictures went straight into the tabloids, the morning papers that ordinary people bought on the street and read on the train. A photograph taken at 2 in the morning could be on 100,000 breakfast tables by 8. This was the opposite of a secret camera used in a locked room. This was a camera that walked straight into the most public moments a city had, and announced itself with a flash everyone could see. The press photographer was not hiding. He was part of the event. For about 3 decades, from the 1930s into the 1950s, the speed graphic essentially was press photography. If you picture a newspaper photographer from that era, the fedora hat, the card-reading press tucked into the band, the big boxy camera held up high with a flash gun on the side, you are picturing a man with a speed graphic. It was so universal that it became a costume, a symbol, a shorthand for the press itself. It stood at the front of every event that mattered. Presidents and prize-fighters, premieres and disasters, crime scenes and coronations. When something happened that the public needed to see, a row of these cameras was there, flashbulbs popping like small explosions. In an age before television brought events into the living room, these photographs were how a nation saw itself. A single frame, printed across the front page, could fix a moment in the memory of millions. The speed graphic did not just record history. For a while, it helped decide which moments became history at all. And every so often, the whole philosophy of this camera came together in a single, unforgettable frame. In 1945, on a small Pacific island called Iwo Jima, a photographer named Joe Rosenthal raised a speed graphic and captured a group of Marines pushing a flag upright on a windswept ridge. He took it in an instant, almost without aiming, and for a moment was not even sure he had it. That one frame became one of the most reproduced photographs in history, printed on a postage stamp, carved into a monument, burned into the memory of an entire country. It is the perfect example of what this difficult camera was built for. Not 100 frames and a lucky pick, but one decisive exposure, made by being in exactly the right place at exactly the right moment. A single sheet of film, 4 inches by 5, holding a moment a whole nation would never forget. And then, fairly quickly, the giant met its match. It did not lose to something bigger and louder. It lost to the exact opposite, to the small, fast, quiet cameras it had always towered over. Through the 1950s and 60s, the 35mm camera came of age. A Leica and then a Nikon could fit in one hand. It carried 36 exposures instead of 1. It could be focused in an instant, fired again and again, and soon driven by a motor that rattled off frame after frame while the photographer simply kept the moment in view. Suddenly, the very things that had made the speed graphic admirable, the discipline, the single shot, the deliberate wait, began to look like limitations. Why bet everything on one exposure when you could take a whole sequence and choose the best? The beast had ruled by being impossible to ignore. Now the world wanted a camera that could keep up, one that vanished into the photographer's hands and never made him stop to reload. So the loud giant left the stage almost silently. Newsrooms traded their speed graphics for compact 35mm bodies. The fist-sized flashbulb gave way to a small electronic flash that could fire again and again. Production of the great press cameras wound down, and by the 1970s the era was effectively over. There was no single dramatic ending, just a slow handing over. A generation of photographers set down a camera that had defined their working lives and picked up something lighter. Today, the speed graphic survives where so many of these stories end, in the hands of collectors and of a few stubborn photographers who still love the discipline of large format. The ritual of one sheet, one focus, one carefully chosen exposure. The machine that had been the noisy, blazing face of the press for 30 years became, in the end, a quiet object of devotion, admired precisely for demanding the patience the modern world had left behind. Think of the two cameras side by side. One was smaller than your thumb, silent, and built to vanish. A camera whose finest hours were spent in locked rooms, capturing things no one was ever meant to see. The other was the size of a briefcase, loud enough to announce itself across a street, and built to be pointed straight at the most public moments of its age. A camera whose finest hours were spent on the front page, capturing things the whole world was meant to see. One disappeared by being invisible. The other ruled by being impossible to ignore. One held our secrets, the other held our headlines. And yet, in a strange way, the speed graphic was chasing the very same impossible dream that runs through this whole series, to make the moment matter more than the machine. It just did it the hard way, by forcing the photographer to be there, to commit, and to get it all in a single, irreversible frame. In an age of endless images, there is something almost unbearably honest about a camera that gave you one shot and asked you to make it count. If you made it this far, subscribe. We tell the stories behind the cameras that changed everything. The obsessions, the gambles, the quiet rebellions, and the people who refused to accept the way things were. Next time, a camera that was the complete opposite of this one. Not loud and public, but quiet and held low at the waist. The camera a nanny carried through the streets, taking 100,000 photographs that almost no one would see until long after she was gone.